I'm Morton Sklar. I was the Director of Human Rights USA, and currently I'm representing one of the designated groups, an Iranian human rights and political organization. Many people are not aware that the material support provisions included restrictions and prohibitions on the provision of legal assistance to any of the designated groups. That's been changed by the regulations, but I'm wondering, since those regulations still involve a great many restrictions on legal representation, including the licensing requirement that you mentioned earlier, has anyone been paying attention to this aspect of the problem or doing anything about it?
Thanks. If you don't mind, panel, I'm going to take a few questions definitely. And then I'll come back to you. Yeah, please.
I'm Hilary Bauer. I'm the Program Officer for MSF USA. I have a comment and a question. I'd like to perhaps support what Joel has said about humanity, because one of the things I find with this act is that we are dehumanizing populations who live in places where they cannot control the authorities, whether they support them or whether they don't support them. So they live there and they are suffering from this inability for us to give them care. I find this strange when we have a US government and other governments that talk about winning hearts and minds, that talk about, winning over the population. So my heart hurts with this particular law. My question, and I'm not entirely sure whether you will be able to answer it, but I wonder whether the US government, given its proclamations of adhering to international humanitarian law, would go so far to prosecute a major US NGO giving humanitarian care. And I'm not talking only about speech, I'm talking about action, the dollar that lets the dollar go for weapons. I just would be interested in the panel's opinion about whether some exemption would be found or whether it would actually go ahead and prosecute.
Great.
Thank you.
Let me take one more question and then I'll come back to the panel. Yes, sir.
My name is Martin de Boer. I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross. My question actually follows that one. As you mentioned, the Supreme Court deferred the decision-making to the executive branch, and my question is, has the executive branch then started to enforce, or what are the examples of how the executive branch then started to enforce the ruling, other than maybe the FBI raids in Chicago or the partner vetting regulations? Are there any other examples on how that's implemented?
Thank you very much. So, Emily, if I could first come to you to address the question of legal assistance in particular, how has that been addressed by this body of laws, and where do you see that going? And then I'll also ask you and then Joel to maybe say a bit more about the OFAC, Department of Treasury angle on all this, because we've talked about it but not really explained it so well.
Sure. Actually, my answer sort of combines those two. I think that the community that's been working to try to narrow the scope of this law, we haven't really singled out any particular types of restrictions because essentially the intent requirement I talked about would solve problems sort of across communities. But there was, when the ACLU wanted to bring a case on behalf of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was the guy in Yemen who was reportedly on the government's list of people to kill with a drone if possible. And so they were challenging that designation and had to apply for a license to engage in that representation. And apparently weeks and weeks go by, they've put in their application, they're waiting for their license. Meanwhile, any day this guy could get killed and render their case moot. But they didn't seem to be moving particularly quickly on issuing that license. And then when the ACLU made that particular, they then filed a suit to compel the government to make a decision on the license, not even just to give them the license, but to make a decision. And that sort of raised the issue a little bit of a higher salience, and I think it was about 26 hours later that the ACLU got the license. So that's the only example I know of that specifically dealt with the legal representation issue.
Thanks, Joel.
Yeah. Hillary, thanks so much for bringing up that question because it's been in the back of my mind. I mean, would the U.S. government, especially this administration, prosecute a major U.S. humanitarian organization? My vote is no. And, you know, this then you get into strategy and tactics with our community. I go way back to the 80s on attempts to impose embargoes on humanitarian assistance to Vietnam, to Cambodia, to Nicaragua, when Oxfam America was denied a license to ship tools to Sandinista-ruled Nicaragua. We actually did a campaign where we more or less dared the administration to prosecute us. We collected tools all over the country. We shipped them to San Francisco, and we fully intended to send the shipment with or without a license. And basically, like a week or 2 days or 24 hours before the shipment was going to go, we got the license. Now, okay, that's romantic history. We're in a different world right now. But seriously, I dare even a Republican administration to, you know, bring Save the Children to court for, you know, feeding starving children in Somalia. I mean, I just don't see it. The problem is that our community is really worried right now. So I mean, I work for Interaction, which is the federation, and our members want Interaction to kind of take the hits and be visibly in the lead. Individual organizations are very reluctant to challenge as individual organizations. So if there is any challenge, it'll probably be in our community by a federation rather than by an individual organization.
I would just add that I think the Obama administration gets this, the challenges, and I think they're looking at it as ways to sort of work through internally how they might address this. The ruling clearly has a chilling effect on activities. I also would agree that the likelihood of a prosecution of a major effort here is pretty close to zero, I would say. But you don't ever know what will happen in another administration, what could happen on a smaller group. So I think it's just healthy to clear it up. And that's why we wrote the letter to Secretary Clinton. And I think both the Justice Department and the State Department need to take action to make it clear they will not prosecute, and then to clear up the definition of material support. That in itself will enable the groups to go back to working for peace 100%.
Thanks very much. Let me open the floor again for questions. I think there were a few of you that went back and sat down. Yes.